rapists to the police, they are least likely to be prosecuted. And why is that? There are several reasons. First of all, because they commit multiple rapes. And that doesn't look good when you have a lot of rapes by the same person. Secondly, because the victim is still living with the guy, so they want to drop the charges off him. And thirdly, and probably most importantly, they have a range of secondary problems because of the history of abuse that makes them bad witnesses. And I'll tell you, this is nothing, I don't want to get into women because we had a dinner, made me very nervous. But when we first did our research and went to the rape team at Yale New Haven Hospital, these bad women who were being raped were being labeled as inappropriate victims. They didn't look like rape victims, they didn't want their partners called in, they didn't see it as apart from all the other abuse. Now this is not the feminist rape crisis people, these are the hospital rape teams that we're talking about. These women were treated as completely exogenous. And I mean, it doesn't, I'm sure all of you know that sexual coercion and rape, which we're going to talk about in more detail in just a minute, are not even included in any of our domestic violence laws. They're not even included. Even though this is the single most important source of rape, and like somewhere between 30 and 50% of battered women, it's depending on the survey, are telling us they've been sexually assaulted, often multiple times. So anyway, so we found all of these problems. And we also found that these problems only became disproportionate after the onset of, and in the context of ongoing abuse. In other words, if you compare battered women and non-battered women, prior to the onset of the abuse, there was no difference in alcohol, suicide attempts, depression, homelessness, HIV, whatever. No difference at all. So these problems developed in the context of the ongoing violence. But the question that we couldn't answer, that I couldn't answer, was why? I mean, part of it was my wife went back to medical school. I was busy cleaning the house. I didn't have time to think. No, but the answer was why was this happening? At the time, the explanation was trauma. Everybody was doing trauma-sensitive work. We were very concerned about post-traumatic trauma. But trauma is associated with severe violence. And 95, 99%, as I just showed you, of the violence is not severe. Its characteristic is frequency of routine level. We have some data from the state of Washington. You may have seen that men's heart rate actually goes down during abusive episodes. Right? For many men, being abusive is like going to the toilet. No, I'm serious. They come home, they go through the routine, it's just a pattern. It's a ritual that you perform. When you come home, you yell, you scream. I had a guy, one of my clients was the anchorman for the morning news, ABC Morning News. I can't say his name because the case is sealed. And his, Morton Dean, I think it was called. And he had a rule in his house that his wife was also, she had been the anchor woman for Channel 5 in New York. And he had made her give up her work to take care of his two worthless children who were in their mid-20s, you know, and manage their Greenwich estate. She was not allowed to go to work once they got married. But he had a rule in the house that she had to answer the phone by the third ring. Or else, right? And this guy, I mean, he never took her seriously. The only evidence I had in the case was a day book that she kept when she wrote, "Mort Goes Crazy." See, I would have had to tell you his name anyway. I know I should believe in confidentiality, but with criminals, I don't believe that. So Mort goes crazy. And crazy, I asked her, what does it mean, Mort goes crazy? He would come home from work, he'd listen to the answering machine. If there were any voices he didn't recognize, he'd call them back. He'd start, you know, throwing dishes around. He'd call her a bitch, call her this, call her that, push her around a little bit, and then he'd lock her in the bedroom about 8 o'clock for the night, and that was it. I'll tell you, when I interviewed that woman in my office and the phone rang, before it got to the third ring, the hives that began in her fingertips had covered her face. No, I'm just giving you a sense of the fear, without any physical violence on me at all. Right? The accumulated fear that came from the or else implication, right? And this woman, I don't go into the court with that woman and say, oh, look at this poor victim. I say, look at this woman who has achieved so much, an Emmy Award-winning TV anchor woman. She made a film about Lucille Ball that won another Emmy, who's done all of these incredible things. And imagine, Your Honor, what it would take to bring such a woman this low. So I'm not claiming she's a pathetic victim. I don't want you to have pity on her. What I want you to recognize is that this woman, with all the autonomy and rights that a full person should have, has been reduced to rightlessness. She has had her rights taken away. She is now a rightless person. And you cannot be a citizen in a society without rights. You cannot be a citizen without rights. You cannot be a person without rights in a political sense. That's what this is about. So for women, and in contrast to the law, we have this ongoing thing. So what I was going to say is, so if all of these problems were not being caused by physical violence, what was causing them? Ta-da! We're going to move another one. Oh, no, okay, well, never mind. We'll go beyond that. Let's go ahead. So all I'm saying there is that when you look at domestic violence from the standpoint of the individual episode, it's trivialized and it's normalized. The police get used to coming to your house. In fact, in a lot of families that I work with, the police arriving is the signal to stop the abuse. They know when they arrive, she's going to be bleeding, he's going to be drunk, maybe the neighbors call. After a while, the police, not unsympathetically, think, I feel bad for this family. But there's something tragic and inevitable. And what happens to us in the social work business, and maybe you've experienced this as clients yourselves, is that as your abuse escalates, as your reporting becomes ever more desperate, we begin to withdraw. We begin to put names for you on our dockets. You're the woman with well-known complaints. You're the hysteric. All these pseudo-psychiatric and other labels, and it's even worse when the labels aren't there, but the behavior is. The police know when they open the door, there they are again. Even a nice policeman is not going to take that seriously. And so you stop calling. And then things even get worse. But you see what I'm saying? So with this framework of violence, we normalize and we trivialize abuse in ways that are terribly harmful. Anyway, so we were trying to figure out why we had all of these problems. And it wasn't the violence. There was nothing we could find out by looking at medical records. And so what has appeared to us now, out of the wonderful sky, and is described in my book, if you buy that, you'll get the secret. What has appeared to us now is that what the woman was telling us when she said violence wasn't the worst part was actually describing the context in which women developed these health problems. That it wasn't the physical violence, but it was the continuity and ongoing nature of oppression in the system of inequality that was and being driven home that was creating this problem. So what we do now, and this is just one division, some of you, if you read the literature, you know that there's a sociologist named Michael Johnson who makes a little different distinction than I do. It's not important what terms we use. But what I want you to get is that some people fight, they hit each other, and they use a lot of violence. We feminists are not interested in this. And we didn't bring the issue of domestic violence to the world because we were concerned about people hitting each other. Men hitting women, women hitting men. You want to hit each other? You want to kick the shit out of each other? That's your business. Do it. If it overflows into the neighborhood, hurts the kids, we're going to make some trouble for you. But that's your business. It's only when violence gets linked to inequality and oppression that we want to step in and we want to say, this is not just violence. This is what the prosecutor in Philadelphia, Michelle Dempsey, who got a PhD in philosophy, legal philosophy from Oxford, calls violence in the strong sense. Violence in the strong sense means violence that recreates and comes out of inequality. And that, Michelle says, is what the prosecution and the judges should be concerned with, not just physical hitting. There are a lot of relationships in which emotional abuse and physical violence are the only elements of abuse. And we deal with them okay. We don't deal with them well because we still don't recognize the frequency, we still don't recognize some of the effects. But usually in these cases of assault, I don't know how many cases I don't have time for, but usually in these cases of assault, the woman retains her autonomy, she keeps her job. Yeah, I'll give you one example. I had a client, and my clients commit crimes. They're not, I'm assuming most of you don't commit too many crimes that get caught in. So my client had thrown a bomb. It was just a Molotov cocktail in her boyfriend's room in his hotel. She burned down the hotel because that's where nobody was killed, nobody was hurt, because that's where he kept his drug money. Now, I mean, I know this is not out of your experience, but it's still something. It was my experience, so I'm telling you the story. In this relationship, when they had started out, she gave as good as she got. If they beat up in the family, he once punched her. She got seriously hurt. She had an ear infection that lasted for a long time. She cut him when they had a fight in the park. She had a ring. She cut him. She damaged his eyesight. And so they gave as good as they could get. But she developed a thyroid condition which significantly weakened her. And so the physical violence became increasingly one way. Even at the height of the physical violence, she was taking care of her mother, who was half paralyzed, working 2 jobs, including driving a cab at night so she could support her worthless brother, who was a drug addict, supporting her children. She was unbelievable. I mean, those of you who know the magic of mothering through domestic violence understand some of what she was doing, right? Mothering through domestic violence is magical. Judges should get down on their knees in front of women who manage to mother through domestic violence. I mean, every one of us does. And we should be building statues, you know, and giving awards simply for surviving that. You know, I go shopping at the supermarket, and it's still, you know, I've been doing it for 50 years, and I try to explain to them if I didn't shop and cook, my children would have starved to death. I mean, I'm not home tonight, so my wife, I'm sure, is ordering pizza out, you know, and stuff like that. I mean, she's very happy, don't get me wrong, I'm just saying, you know, I can't eat that stuff. I got a heart condition, you know, and made it worse. But the point is that this woman, as badly as she was physically abused, was maintaining herself in every single way as a full and independent human being. Obviously, she had a right to protection and safety, but this was assault. And now what we're finding out is that somewhere around 60% of the women that we are seeing in the family court, in the criminal court, in the shelters, in the emergency rooms, in the child welfare systems, are not experiencing physical and emotional abuse. What they're experiencing is this pattern of coercive control. And Mo will now show us this pattern of coercive control. And you just keep hitting the things and do it. It's good. Thank you so much. And basically, for the sake of discussion, I divided into physical violence, intimidation, in which I include stalking and degradation, isolation and control. There are many other ways you could talk about your experience in these situations. So let's start with the physical violence. We can move on with it. So this is sexual violence. So we can skip this because I've said that already. But what that shows is in the CDC study, 51% of the sexual violence reported by women in the United States is committed by partners. And the vast majority of women, I was going to tell you about the physical violence. So we've learned a lot about, I'll come to this in a second. We've learned a lot already about physical violence. We know it's routine, we know the hallmarks of physical abuse. And you should always remember this, is that it's often, it's frequent. And frequent doesn't mean it happens 3 times a week, like 30% of the women report. It could happen 3 times a year. That's still frequent. You combine that in a 15-year marriage, you're talking about 45 assaults. So don't trivialize that. And in many cases, well, violence has stopped, right? Yeah, violence stopped because he doesn't need to use it anymore. Because the or else, when he says pass the coffee in the morning, or I expect dinner to be at the table at 7, even though he doesn't return home till 9, right? We all know that trick, right? That violence, that or else, is hanging in the air. So men only use violence as something that men, all right, some men use it as sort of a way of getting something out of their system. But for many men, most men, violence abuse is instrumental. They get a lot out of being abusive. I mean, a lot of women will say, well, what do they want? Anyway, you know, if he wants oral sex, I'll give him oral sex. What's the big deal? You know, even anal sex occasionally. But there are economic privileges, there are social privileges, there are time privileges, there are status privileges that even the most derelict man derives from, just like poor white Southerners derived from exploiting black sharecroppers in the 30s. Even the most derelict man derives a sense of power and authority and privilege from abuse. Men do it because they, not only because they can, but because they actually, abuse is a rational instrumental behavior. Don't forget that. And as we move from violence, I'm willing to admit that there are a certain number of men who are violent because they have some kind of frontal lobe epilepsy, or somebody hit them on the head too hard when they were in prison, or what have you. I'm willing to accept that. But when you move to coercive control, as you're going to see, which is 60% of the cases, you're not talking about psychotic, deformed men. You're talking about men who plan and scheme and strategize and use tactics too. And I mean, I don't want to make you feel sorry for these guys, but I worked with them for a long time. Being coercive and controlling is hard work. No, I'm serious about that. I mean, I had one guy in my group who almost got killed. He was so jealous, he would follow his wife to sewing class because he was convinced she was going there to meet other men with his lights off at night. And one night he goes down a ditch and he almost killed himself. He ran into a tree, he came into group, he was like, you know, he missed like 3 weeks of group. He came in a half body cast. And I said, I said, John, did you get to the meeting? He said, no, I ended up in the hospital. I said, well, you missed it. She's probably with some other man. Sometimes you got to encourage these guys. You got to get rid of them. It's not that easy. No, but for the most part, this is rational, instrumental behavior within the logic of their thinking. It may not be, it's not a pathology in the clinical sense. It's a pathology, what I call a normal pathology. That it's a pathology rooted in the way we understand masculinity to be, the way we understand manhood to be. And when you combine manhood with opportunities for exploitation because of sexual inequality, persistent inequality, you get coercive control. In other words, if women could just leave and they were fully independent and autonomous to go to the courts and they were treated with complete dignity and respect, it would be over like that. So it's because women are half free and half slave at the same time. Now the conservatives would love it if we would just go back. Right? I would love it. To be honest with you, I would love it. I would love it if I came home at night, now my wife's retired, she's cooking like 2 nights a week, which is amazing. And she's a good, I suppose I lay out the menu, buy the food, get it on the table, she'll cook. I love it. No, I mean, I don't want to sound sexist, but I mean, there was nothing better in my life than being served by my mother. All these years when my father sat at the table, or he read his newspaper, corrected our grammar, my mother served the dinner when we were finished. I loved it. I thought, I'm going to find a woman like that someday. You grew up in Colombia, you know what I'm talking about. I mean, no, but I don't mean to make fun of this. I'm just pointing out that these are not irrational feelings. It's just that you can't find women like that anymore today. It's very hard. Even Italian women aren't like that anymore. If they ever were. So it's I don't want to sound racist. So the other thing I think I want to emphasize about the violence is that it's not about conflict. 10% of us are beaten in our sleep. What men are trying to do with violence is not resolve conflict, but suppress conflict. They don't want challenges. They don't want, right? So anybody tells you these are people who don't know how to have conflict, this ain't the truth. Now, it is true that when I'm working with men in group, one of the things I teach them is how to fight. I teach them how to argue, how to get, how to ask for things. Because they go from hurt to fury without passing through anything in between. They don't know any better. But of course, nobody makes them know any better because when they get arrested, as you see, no one's going to jail. So I just stop with that in terms of conflict. And I talked to you a little bit about the sex stuff, but I want you to get, and I can't make too much of a point of this, that when I talk about coercive control, we're not talking about psychological abuse. France made a crime out of psychological abuse. insulting people, calling them names, demeaning. I understand that. That's a terrible thing to happen. But the difference between demeaning somebody and hurting them psychologically, but they can still walk away, and demeaning somebody who knows that if they turn their back or walk away, that's going to be ramifications for them, for their children, and for their family and everybody else, is the difference between day and night. You see what I'm saying? So that yes, emotional abuse is bad, but I'm not talking about emotional abuse. I'm talking about a combination, as we're going to see, of physical and structural dependence, which is created, and in which Anne's saying the pizza didn't come, so what are you supposed to do? Yes, my mother is dead, so it can't be her. And it's really important to understand this, because what we're talking about is getting the narratives of your experience into law, into public documents, into public testimonials. So that the sexual coercion, and by sexual coercion, rape is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Reproductive coercion, which you all know about. I don't have time to talk about the whole thing, but I have not had one case in which there wasn't some element, important element, of sexual degradation, sexual inspections, marking, and it ends at sex is routine. By rape is routine, I mean. And by rape is routine, I simply mean that women consent because they're afraid if they don't. I mean, Dealer, one of my clients, right after she got married, she laughed on the phone with his uncle, and he punched her in the mouth, and then he tied his hands behind her back, and had his way with her, as she told me. And she said, I never said no to him again. But that is still, in my view at least, rape. It becomes a chronic way of relating. So trying to have a vocabulary where we can talk about doing sexual things that we don't want to do. I know this has been sort of popularized with the campus thing about do they say yes, do they say no. I'm not talking about yes and no. I'm talking about a kind of permissiveness that takes place in terms of a chronic oppression in which the woman's body is reduced to an instrument of his pleasure with no other entity, no other consideration going on. And of course, you're dealing with people, many of whom are narcissistic. By narcissistic, I mean that they interpret any harm and problem to you as an insult to them. One of my clients was the wife of the guy who's chair of ophthalmology at Yale. When she got cancer, he tried to remove her cancer by spraying her with Raid, because he saw her cancer as an offense to him. By drawing attention to herself, she was taking attention away from him. The softball player, right? The softball player, one of my clients who was a terrific softball player. And I'll never forget the story, because this is how we learn about these things in my business. People tell stories and they don't leave you, and you begin to understand the meaning. And she was a tremendous pitcher, and they had a rule in the house that she would not make him jealous. And you know who's the judge and jury. And so he would come to all the games, which the other women thought was just wonderful, because the other blokes were off drinking or doing whatever they were doing. And when she would strike out 4 or 5 people in a row, he would come down onto the field and say, darling, you're cold. You read that. Here's your sweatshirt. And she would break out, and sweat, and she couldn't pitch anymore, and her teammates thought, what a wonderful guy. And you get it, right? I don't have to tell you that what the message was. And even if he never touched her that night, the message that you're going to have to cover up tonight was very, very clear, because she had done something wrong. And where do they like to attack you? Exactly when the thing you are doing is the thing you love most. When you're getting the most pleasure. That's the surprise attack, I call that. The surprise attack. When they're sleeping, you know how you learn from warfare? Oh, they're sleeping. You always see this in the movies, the German World War II movies. They're having a party and enjoying themselves. That's when you attack them and kill them. I can do that at home. When she's gardening, when she's, because pleasure is pleasure taken from me. It's all a zero sum. It's all a zero sum game. So let's see if we can move on. This is just one of my concerns. We can move on. And degradation, I don't know if sexual inspections or something like that is something you're familiar with. I know in my population, of women who are mostly accused of committing crimes. It's very, very common. That there's a way that men have of telling whether you've been with other men. But it doesn't have to be physical. I had a woman who moved to Connecticut from New Jersey, an African-American woman who was a nurse, and I actually knew her father, who was a minister in Patterson. Wonderful, wonderful man. Very, very strict and wonderful. And by the way, I identify my clients because I don't consider my talking about, of course, all the stuff I write about in court is public record. But these are all women I talk to, and they want their stories told. They don't see themselves as hiding away from the rest of society. They see themselves as sitting in the front of the bus and telling stories about their own lives and having their own. We always speak in the names of battered women. We should have them speak their own names and surround them so that it's possible to do that safely. But anyway, this woman came to New Jersey, and she's minister's daughter, and her husband, had this way of telling whether she'd been with other men. And I can tell these stories, I think, here in this crowd. So, I mean, they're a little off. And the way he could tell whether she was with other men was, she would get home about 3 o'clock from work, and she would take a shower, change her clothes, go out and shop for dinner. And he would come home about 4 or 5 o'clock. First thing he would do is go into the hamper, take out her underwear, and he could tell by smelling her underwear whether that she had been with another man. Well, men can tell us. We have ways. Olfactory sensitivities. Anyway, he thought he could tell us. The only thing that she changed in her routine was that she would come home now, she would take her shower, and then she would put on the clothes that she had worn all day. That was the only change she made. Remember what I said before about the smaller the degradation, the more shame she feels. Because she feels now, this daughter of a minister, right? And she is his in some sense. She has been rendered helpless. And there's all kinds of other marking. Let's see if we can get through this. So yes, please. Let's go on. So let's move on from this too, because I talked a little bit about this. I want to talk about stalking, and then we'll talk a little bit about the use of children. So let's move on. Oh, okay, so this is just a kind of stalking. I'm going to try to skip over my stalking slides, but I want you to know that stalking is a major part of coercive control. And there is no law in the United States against stalking in relationships. Stalking in this society and in all of Europe, until we passed the coercive control law in England, was a crime committed when people were separated across social space. And what we are finding is that 57% of the women who are stalked in abusive relationships, the stalking begins while the couple is still together. And it involves a range of surveillance tactics which are as devastating, if not more devastating, than physical violence or any other form of abuse, because you never know when he's going to be there. My friend T.K. Logan at the University of Kentucky has done extensive research showing the sleeplessness, the depression, the suicidality associated with the stalking behavior when it's combined. The idea that he always knows where you are, that there's no space that's yours. The big difference between domestic violence and coercive control is that coercive control crosses social space. It follows women to work. It follows women to shopping. It follows them to their family affairs, using all kinds of technologies so that there is no place where you are that is your home. Part of what I do when I'm presenting, I was going to talk about this later, but I'm going to run out of time, so I'll just say it now. Part of what I talk about when I'm presenting a case is that, I'll give you an example. It's a family case I'm doing now. And she had an affair. She remarried the guy and she had an affair. And in Connecticut, they're using the affair to show that she caused the breakdown of the marriage, even though there were protection orders, there was physical abuse, there were years of abuse. I mean, they're going to lose the case, but there's millions of dollars involved, so they're very sensitive to that. And they asked me, "Doctor, what do you think about her affair?" I said, "Best thing that she did." I said, "The affair was the safety zone." And what do I mean by that? I mean that what happens is these guys choke off the spaces in which people try to breathe the air of a free person. They go through the diaries, they go through the drawers, they go through all of those mementos and things where people try to salvage some sense that they're not being controlled. It might be a supplemental relationship. It might be anything. One case of mine was her dead brother's baseball hat on the mantelpiece. Anything that reminds them that there's a world apart from this guy. In the burning bed, you remember, she was having a relationship with the guy, the police officer at the community college. And I always felt that that movie should have been called, that story should have been called The Burning Book, not The Burning Bed. And I asked Francine about this. I said to her, Francine, you know, I know they call this The Burning Bed because you killed your husband in the bed. But notice they don't label the case by what he did to you. They label it by what you did to him. But what did he do to you? And of course, you have to remember, if you remember was it Farrah Fawcett or whoever, you have to remember the story. That she was going to college. That was her safety zone. And she was having this relationship with this cop. That was her safety zone. And that night, he had made her burn her books. Do you remember that? Because what men do when women eke out these safety zones is they go on search and destroy missions. Right? Like the guy who was listening to the answering machine. And then they try to close those off. And literally, women complain about choking even when they've been strangled. And because they're being choked off. And what's being choked, of course, is breathing the air of a free person. And so this, of course, is social space. This is an ad in England that we developed. And this beeper game, and now the texting game, was something that we had. I know I should have mentioned this, but I had a hate case like this. I whether you like the hate cases. I agree with her. But the bad cases. But this was a case where he would text her something. Like he would text the number to Marshall's, and she not only had to guess that it was Marshall's, but what kind of shirt he wanted for his birthday. Or he would text the number of the police, and she had to guess what would happen if she called the police. But you see what I'm saying? That he would use this kind of electronic stalking as a way of extending his control through social space. The frequent calls at work, the showing up outside of work. Oh, darling, I just want to pick you up. Let's go out for lunch. You know, calling other people at work, harassing through the network. These are all forms of stalking behavior, which we have yet to incorporate and understand fully into that. So this just gives you an idea of stalking. Marek is in Britain. I guess I made the slide for Britain. 8.4 times women who are stalked, more danger to children than when they're not stalked. Stalking is a huge divider, electronic surveillance. I just did a case, Bobby O'Neill, who's an all-star baseball player for the New York Mets, spent $300,000 a year on surveillance work. Give you an idea what these guys are doing. Let's see if we can move on through these. So this is an example of internal stalking I just took from one woman. I go to the bathroom, and if I was in there, you know, just sitting there, it was a relief. She thought, thank God I'm alone, just go to the bathroom. To me, that was like going to Paris for some women. And if I was in there 2 minutes longer than he thought I should be